Hello, I'm Bob Trubshaw. I'd like to talk to you today about something which is seemingly so obvious we never stop to think of it as a work of fiction, still less how it was invented. As the title makes clear, this video looks at the invention of the English rural idyll. Now, it is a widespread human myth of the good old days, a never quite specified time, approximately contemporary with one's grandparents, when everything was better than it is today. And rural England had long been the venue for such myths. Back in 1975, William Keith published a pioneering study of the rural idyll as depicted in English literature. And William Keith places Isaac Walton's book, The Complete Angler, which was written in 1653, as pretty much the root of this English rural idyll. I'm going to quote William Keith's summary. The complete angler begins, and therefore, to all intents and purposes, the English rural tradition begins, with three men, Piscator, Venator, and Auceps, meeting on a road leading out of London this fine, fresh May morning. The setting is at one and the same time familiar and original. Inevitably, we recall the congregation of pilgrims at the Tabard Inn at the opening of the Canterbury Tales. But, whereas Chaucer presents us with a journey from the secular city to the sacred cathedral of God, Walton shows us three men leaving London for the enjoyment of the countryside. True, the River Lee may at first sight appear a trivial goal compared with the shrine at Canterbury, yet the overall tone of Walton's book is more sober and, despite the parson's concluding and comprehensive sermon, interestingly paralleled by Piscator's speech in the final chapter, more pious than that of Chaucer's poem. While at Canterbury the pilgrims turn a holy duty into a diverting recreation, Piscator converts a secular hobby into a contemplation and celebration of God's gifts to man on earth. Isaac Walton was followed by Gilbert White and other literary rural idealisers. Along with these was the work of the political radical William Cobbett, also creating a widespread belief that rural England had been ideal, when each man had a cottage, a pig, and use of the common. That was a scenario in Cobbett's lifetime that was largely being superseded by the effects of parliamentary enclosure. Cobbett's idealism was disseminated in popular broadsheet ballads, which gave the underlying ideals such widespread currency. By the 1830s they had become truisms. This rural idyll was prevalent in 19th century literature, and not directly opposed at the time. Now, as William Keith states, it's worth noting that Piscator, Walton's mouthpiece, is a townsman. Indeed, all writers about rural England, such as Isaac Walton and Gilbert White, only became popular in the Victorian era with the advent of an urban readership. Reading about the countryside was, and still is, not merely a substitute for visiting the countryside, but often preferable to the reality. Early urban development soon developed into squalid living conditions where basic sanitation was lacking and epidemics of diseases such as cholera could not be controlled. One of the Victorian obsessions was attributing illnesses to bad air. Now, quaint as these notions are now that we understand bacteria and viruses, they were fundamental to the positive perceptions of the rural environment, where the air was considered to be generally good. Indeed, modern tourism, with its fetish for the seaside, has its origins in Georgian England and the supposed ozone of the coast air, although we now know that stimulating sea breezes smell not of ozone but of, rotting seaweed. The notion of bad air is now regarded as totally fallacious. Nevertheless, it was a primary cause in the creation of an imagined tradition that has become increasingly important in Britain, what we think of as the countryside. Attempts to preserve aspects of the countryside began in 1865 when the Commons Preservation Society came into being. 30 years later, in 1895, the National Trust was formed. Not, as one would be forgiven for thinking, to look after countless upper-class stately homes, but to provide land access benefits for the working classes. The National Trust was part of a wider group of radical and liberal protest movements which sought land access. However, by the 1920s, these organisations had been thoroughly infiltrated by the landowning classes, so in the 1930s the National Trust turns its attention away from preserving and providing access to places of natural beauty, and instead became preoccupied with preserving what were then redundant country houses. So, where does the invented tradition of the British countryside arise, and how does it shift so quickly along the political spectrum? Well, intriguingly, these ideas and changes are largely attributable to the success and longevity of what we might thought of as one of the institutions of British publishing, a weekly magazine called Country Life. Country Life magazine was founded in 1897, the year of Queen Victoria's Diamond Jubilee, and, 2 years after the creation of the National Trust. Unlike almost all other periodicals of its time, the emphasis was visual rather than literary. It was well designed and used newly invented high-quality photographic printing technology. These images presented a romantic vision of unspoilt villages, rolling landscapes, country houses, and the nation's heritage of cathedrals and castles and historic cities. By the time Country Life was founded, most of the population lived in suburban surroundings. These were the people who predominantly bought into this romantic rural idyll. The influential thinker John Ruskin added his weight to the belief that the countryside provided an antidote of order and tranquillity that was lacking in industrial society. There's no record of him inquiring whether the rural population thought they were living in order and tranquillity. By the Edwardian era, the readership of Country Life was predominantly female. For many decades, the cover featured a debutante from the minor aristocracy, photographed in a conventional, flattering style. Every issue featured a country house, photographed with almost all evidence of its inhabitants eradicated, not even a copy of the Times on a study desk, or a handy pair of bedroom slippers cluttered the images. The emphasis was on rural leisure, rather than on toil. Country Life promoted sport suitable for gentlemen, such as the then new fashion for golf. Indeed, the idea for the magazine was first discussed on a golf course. Hunting and shooting were also promoted as part of this romanticised tradition, an early emphasis that controversially remained a mainstay of editorial attitudes. Above all, Country Life made the countryside glamorous and nurtured the aspirations for successful businessmen to sell up their urban houses and acquire the appearances of a gentleman by taking up rural residence. As Sir Roy Strong put it, more than any other magazine, Country Life was to become the manual of gentrification for the late Victorian and Edwardian middle classes. It was created at a crucial period in the formation of the attitudes and ideas which were to dominate British society well into the 20th century. Now, the reality of rural Britain was totally at odds with Country Life's romantic image. Changes in the rural economy during the 18th and 19th centuries had been every bit as dramatic as the industrialisation and massive growth of urban areas. Georgian England had been marked by the social consequences of enclosure and the loss of common lands, while improving the efficiency of farming by concentrating land and power into the hands of the gentry was to result in the creation in a large number of landless poor. When these were not required for military service, such as after the end of the Napoleonic Wars, the problems of vagrants and beggars became difficult for the authorities to contain. In parts of England, many families eked out their survival in such poverty-stricken trades as framework knitting. Only as the 19th century unfolded and industrialised urban areas grew did this poverty steadily migrate from rural settlements to the slums of the new cities. The aspirations of the professional and urban-based readers of Country Life saw the life of a country gentleman as particularly desirable. Each week's issue provided what Sir Roy Strong describes as a pantheon of images that gradually formed a powerfully enticing illustration of national identity. The overwhelming impression was, and still is, of continuity and tradition. The illusion crossed ideological boundaries. To socialists such as William Morris, the lost idyll was one where an honest craftsman could practice his skills within the security of an unchanging village community. Simultaneously, tourists could envisage an age where the social hierarchy lay undisturbed, guided by the landed classes who dominated local affairs as their natural right. The major social changes of the 1920s included the advent of the 5-day working week and thus the invention of the weekend. Developments in private motoring increased the interest in the countryside that had already been aroused by railways and bicycles, leading to vastly more day trips at weekends. Country houses, ruined castles, parish churches and picturesque villages were the prime destinations. Now, country life was written for the upper classes, even though the majority of readers were middle class. Towards the opposite end of the social scale, the Clarion was aimed at the upper working classes, especially those with middle-class aspirations. The Clarion had started off as a socialist agenda, but by the 1920s was promoting cycling, walking and the enjoyment of rural pleasures. The editor of the Clarion was Robert Blatchford, who wrote a book called Merry England. As the title suggests, it promotes a romanticised rural idyll. The popularity of that idyll is indicated by the fact that sales of Merry England exceeded 1 million copies. Even greater commercial success was attained in the 1930s by the King's England series of guidebooks written by Arthur Mee, and also the Shell Guides. These too had promoted the romance of the rural idyll and, to a large extent, shaped the concepts of countryside which we still hold today. In the mid-1980s there were rivals to country life, such as Countryman, The Field, The Lady and This England, and these also promoted this fantasy traditional lifestyle. And then the emerging concept of, poorly defined heritage, combined with increased interest in rural living, promoted the launch of other periodicals, notably one called Country Living, which appealed to this new middle-class interest in the countryside. Indeed, so pervasive was the notion of rural escapism that it could be gently satirised by the television sitcom The Good Life. Although England is essentially urban, for the majority of people their ideals are rural, even though these ideals are based almost entirely on illusions rather than reality.